Let's clear up the confusion. There are so many terms in real estate and real estate investment that get mixed up, but some of the worst with the biggest consequences have to do with the ending of a lease, moving out, eviction, lease termination, notice to quit. All these things are really confusing, and if you're hearing these terms, you might need them defined. So I'm going to define the 8 key terms you need to know as we talk about ending residential leases. But first, I'm Hold It with PM Jen, a 22-year industry veteran who makes content for real estate investors about the hold part of the buy and hold strategy. Admittedly, the toughest part. But I promised you 8 key terms and we're getting started. The first one, month to month. So what does month to month mean and when does that happen? Typically what month to month means is the lease is now at a point where either the landlord or the tenant can provide 30, 60, 90 days notice. I know we call it month to month, but it just simply means that it's on a rolling indefinite basis and that at any point notice can be provided to terminate it. Usually in the lease, there is a predefined notice period. In my community, in my market, we use 30, but where I used to work in more central Pennsylvania, the convention was 60. Now in Pennsylvania, there's no rules about this beyond what you put in your contract. But depending on where you are in the country, you might have rules from your municipality or state about how the notice to vacates would work. But when people are talking about month to month, they often mean that. Now, there is an assumption that when you write a 1-year lease, and nothing is detailed about what happens at the end of that lease. It simply says lease begins on January 1 and ends on December 31. There's an assumption that when December 31 passes, that lease is now in month-to-month status. And that might very well be true if the lease says that. But if the lease does not say that and the tenant continues to live in the home, the housing provider continues providing the housing service, the rent keeps being paid, and everybody keeps acknowledging the agreement and working under it as if they had been, then many judges would construe that lease to have been renewed through continued performance. So if you believe your lease is over, after the lease is over, please make sure you consult with your attorney and ensure that the actual document is making that happen. The second term, and we already brought it up once, is called the notice to vacate. And the notice to vacate refers to, usually it's required in writing, whatever notice the tenant is going to be providing to the landlord. So when the tenant is saying to the landlord, I'm not going to renew the lease, or I'm going to provide you 30 days notice in accordance with our agreement, they are providing a notice to vacate. Like I said, it's usually in writing, and it's very important, landlords, that you get that in writing. So say somebody says, well, I'm leaving the property on June 30th, terminating my lease and returning possession to you. Great. Maybe you go and secure a new tenant to move in on July 8th, right? 1 week later. And when July 1st comes along and the tenant hasn't left, and they haven't provided notice in writing, they have an argument to say that maybe they didn't actually intend to vacate and maybe that lease hasn't been terminated. So if you're going to be going out and you're going to be releasing the property or making arrangements for contractors to come in, it's a good idea to have that notice to vacate in writing. Now, what if the landlord is providing notice to the tenant that the lease isn't going to be renewed? Well, that is usually called a lease termination or a lease non-renewal. So it's a little friendlier to call it a lease non-renewal, but it's also called a lease termination. And there's, here in Pennsylvania anyway, no rules about what reasons a landlord has to give or even that they have to give a reason. It's treated very much as if, when the tenant is ready to move out, they simply provide notice and go on. The landlord can't force the tenant to continue living in the home, paying rent, and going by the terms of that agreement. Well, the same way, when the lease is over, the landlord has an option to not engage in a renewal agreement with that tenant, and they have the right to terminate the lease and get that property back. And that can often be viewed as unfair, but we must remember what these are to begin with. These are rental arrangements on leases, never meant to be permanent, always negotiated for these small months or years at a time. Well, the next 5 terms, they're a little edgier. They get into more conflict. We're going to start with lease violation. What is a lease violation? Well, it is simply any notice the landlord provides to the tenant saying, hey, you're violating some term of the lease. And usually it's done in writing, but there's no legal requirement to be doing that. If I'm simply notifying and instructing my tenant to get compliant with the agreement. So maybe it's that the lawn care has fallen behind and the grass now exceeds the code's limit for length and we've got to get the lawn cleaned up. I could issue a lease violation. It doesn't have to incur any fines. It doesn't have to cost anything. It really is just that in writing notice. I'm putting you on notice you're in violation and I'm expecting compliance. Good practice is to make sure that if you have lease violations occurring, that you're issuing them, that you're communicating them respectfully, following up and getting compliance. Because if you don't get compliance, you're going to incur greater risk and you might get yourself into a situation where we've got to know the next 4 terms. Notice to quit. That is a legal term, right? You've heard that, or the pay or quit notice. And it's called different things in different states, but often quit is in the word. And notice to quit simply means it's a more formal notice in writing. There are different rules in different states about how that can be delivered and how much notice to remedy this must be given. In Pennsylvania, it can be either a 10-day or a 30-day notice to quit. I won't get into this video about the differences, but I did make a 4-part series on evictions in Pennsylvania. Check out that series on my YouTube channel. I go into a lot of detail about lease lengths and reasons for breach and what kind of notice to quit you might need to be using. In Pennsylvania, our typical notice to quit we're doing is a 10-day. And so we're required to post it on the property, like on the door, face out. We can't put it in an envelope and seal it up and mail it or tape the envelope to the door. Instead, we are taking the piece of paper, just like my playbook here, and we're taping it to the door and putting it out. And it might say the date, the tenant's name, and the violation we're interested in, but Pennsylvania has said that is the way you post the property for the notice to quit. And so notice to quit is the beginning in Pennsylvania of the eviction process. It's the formal notice to the tenant that they have 10 days or 30 days, depending, to either fix what's going wrong. Maybe if it's non-payment, bring the account current. If there's an animal in there and there shouldn't be, get the animal out. Whatever it is, get it right or get out within that time period. And it doesn't literally mean you have 10 days to get out, but it does mean I'm putting a clock on this. If you watch my 4-part series and you start figuring out what kind of notice to vacate you need, you're gonna start coming up against 2 terms that you're gonna need to understand: material and immaterial breach. So a material breach of the lease typically has to do with money. Material, right? It's a material matter. It's very easy to know if it's been handled. And of course, most of our lease violations that get to the court stage have to do with money and are material. So a material breach is treated one way, and an immaterial or not about money breach is treated another way. And so it could be different lengths of notice to quit. It could be different assumptions of what's reasonable by the judge. But an immaterial breach would be something like, I have animals in the house and I shouldn't. I have too many people living there. Maybe my housekeeping is bad. Maybe I'm damaging the property in some kind of way. And I'll tell you, in courts, it is much easier to have a hearing on a material breach than an immaterial breach. The burden of proof is high, and these are people and it's their homes and there's all kinds of things. It's material breaches are a lot easier to pursue than immaterial breaches. The next term we're going to talk about is judgment. Judgment is the word that refers to the judge's decision at a landlord-tenant hearing. So you did your notice to quit, they didn't remedy. You filed your landlord-tenant complaint and you got a hearing. And when you go to the hearing, the goal is to achieve a judgment, right? You want the judge to say, I order in favor of you, landlord, the plaintiff, and give you a judgment, which is an order of what you're owed. So maybe the rent's $1,000 a month, the tenant hasn't paid for 2 months, has a $100 per month late fee, and of course filing costs. So in that case, my judgment might be $2,200, right, for rent and late fees, 2 months of rent, 2 months of late fees, and another $175 in court costs. And the judge would order $2,375. The judge would order a judgment of $2,375, and that marks the decision the judge has made. That judgment is what I've won in court and what I'm going to seek to get enforced when it isn't remedied. You notice I haven't used the word eviction yet or defined it, and it is the last one we're going to talk about, but I want to explain to you exactly what eviction is. Eviction is when I have a judgment from the courts that says the judge ordered me to be paid or for you, tenant, to have done something and you don't. And I go back to the court and I say, Judge, you gave me a judgment. I haven't been paid it. I haven't been granted it by the other party. I'm seeking to enforce my judgment with an order of possession, which is the eviction, right? I'm going to, because you're not complying, I'm going to take my property back. And so in Pennsylvania, we would file what's called an order of possession. The constable would say, okay, this date and time, I'm going to be out there and I'm going to execute the eviction. The eviction is when the constable arrives, they enter the property, ensure that the person is no longer there, and returns the possession to the landlord. And by returns the possession, again, we're identifying no people or living beings are left behind. Usually there's a lot of stuff in the apartment. And then the landlord is there, or in our case, we're there changing locks, taking back possession. So we're locking out that person and we're actually doing the eviction. Nothing else is an eviction. The landlord-tenant complaint hearing is just that. It's not really an eviction hearing. It's I'm seeking a judgment. When I terminate your lease, I'm not evicting you. When I non-renew your lease, we're not evicting you. So eviction really refers to when the legal authority has been granted by the judge. The legal authority has been granted to a law enforcement officer by the judge saying it is time to return this property to the possession of the landlord because of an unsatisfied judgment. That and only that is an eviction. Maybe you're still confused. Maybe you want to know more. Let me know in the comments other terms you've heard or are confused about. Let's get them straight. Earlier in this video, I showed you my 2025 no bullshit playbook for buying and holding rentals in North Central PA. You can get yours for free at holditwithpmgen.com. You just give me an email and you get 20 pages of detailed market information from last year for my market, how things work with our codes, local ordinances, utilities, everything you need to be successful in buy and hold investment here in my market. And if you come to my market and don't say hi, I'm going to be big mad. Until next time.